Hi, everybody. Welcome to Knock and Talk today. Joining me are Rachael Frost and my friend and good partner, Matt Talbot. And we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff we've had. By we, I mean, the world, but we're going to focus on the U.S. for a little bit here. We've had a tough week and a half with a lot of threat issues and violence and targeted violence that's gone on, really affecting a lot of our young people and some of our communities that have been very unfortunately marginalized along the way, with the shooting that happened yesterday, or was it early this morning?
Yeah, early this morning. We had, on top of, we've got a couple other incidents that we want to highlight that happened that I know don't sit well with us because this is the world that we live in. And fortunately, you think that after a while, it just rolls off, but it doesn't. I mean, every case is a little bit different, looks a little bit different, and it's still just lives being impacted. And it doesn't necessarily have to be lives being lost, but you think there are far more casualties in incidents than necessarily fatalities and people impacted. So this is what we woke up to this morning, and we'll take a listen to what happened.
New details just released after a deadly mass shooting at an LGBTQ nightclub in Colorado. Police finished a news conference moments ago where they identified the suspect, who is now in custody. At least 5 people were killed, another 18 were injured. The shooting happened just before midnight at Club Q in Colorado Springs. They say 2 people inside the club fought to stop the carnage.
Initial evidence and interviews indicate that the suspect entered Club Q and immediately began shooting at people inside as he moved further into the club. While the suspect was inside of the club, at least 2 heroic people inside the club confronted and fought with the suspect and were able to stop the suspect from continuing to kill and harm others. We owe them a great debt of thanks.
CNN's Nadia Romero is following all the latest developments. All right, what more?
All right. Well, I'm going to stop it there. And I think we have a couple things that just pop out immediately. One, obviously this is terrible, but it's very reminiscent of 2016 at Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Of course, just even if you just look at the demographic population targeted here, but the nature in which he almost strategically and tactically went in there. But I think another thing that pops up that we should maybe talk about is they're all different versions of run, hide, fight, defend, deny, things like that. And what we've heard, and I'm starting to wonder, and I think it's worth a discussion as other people may be thinking it too, is that the best approach? And with all your law enforcement experience, I'm interested to hear what you have to think about this, but should we be telling people run, hide, fight when could it have been that the fight leading this was the key to neutralizing the situation to stop it from becoming worse in terms of numbers of fatalities than it ultimately could have been, whereas it rose to mirror that which we saw in Pulse, which based on numbers was significantly higher. But I'm interested in your take, but just another significant event in this week. We've had quite a few.
Well, I would say, we can train whatever we want in terms of that run, hide, fight component, and we can ask, but that's a big ask of people, right? To ask people, because they have to know when they're doing that there's a potential that I'm giving my life for the lives of everybody else in here. Don't get me wrong. There are people who are, whether you're a first responder or not, you could be someone who's born, if you will, for lack of a better term, the terms that we use as sheepdog, right? You could just have people who are out there who are just born sheepdogs. Like, I am not, we're kind of getting to that point. And we've heard that, from 9/11 even, right? With the plane that was supposed to go into the White House and how it went down in the Pennsylvania field, because we had a group of people who were like, no, absolutely not. We're not going to let that happen. And whether or not they knew that they were going to give their lives when they did that, they couldn't, I think maybe at that point when you think I'm going to die anyway, might as well save somebody else, right, from that happening. So that's a hero moment. I don't think you can train a hero moment into somebody. You can add the component of in run, hide, fight to the fight component of the fight is going to end this sooner rather than later. But we also have some very tragic, they're all tragic, but some very tragic outcomes of people who tried to fight and were killed in the process. And we have numerous, examples of that. The shooting out in Colorado at the STEM Academy from that young man who, wanted to help save everybody.
Right.
And then we have other situations where people have been shot, maybe not killed, and so on. And of course, unfortunately, we have too many examples.
Yeah. And the
we have too many
anomaly
examples
could
to
be
talk about some of this
that
stuff.
for the event that we recently put on, and when we were out in Oklahoma City, and we heard from our keynote speaker was James Shaw Jr., and he was the individual who happened to be under unusual circumstances, be at a Waffle House, back in 2018 in the outside of Nashville in Antioch, Tennessee. Interestingly, with his story, it was the third or fourth restaurant they were going to go to late that evening, early that morning, and if you speak to him, and he's been public about this, that in the moment he tried to run, he tried to hide, and then those weren't options anymore, and he knew he had to fight, looked for an opportunity, and neutralized the shooter, was able to wrestle the weapon away, to really just prevent any further carnage than had already taken place. I mean, he incurred some pretty significant burns in his hand from the barrel of the gun, but that's not going to be common. And it's not always a guarantee that you're going to come out of there physically unscathed, because psychologically that's not the case for him, or likely to be for anybody. We're just not wired for that. But
I think
it's an example.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, it's just an example of where the fight is ultimately what neutralized that situation and allowed other people to run and hide and
that
get
right
away.
there, that's a sacrifice. That's sacrificing yourself because you don't know the outcome. And I will say, and I can't speak for every first responder, of course, because everybody's got different, capabilities. But in general, first responders will consistently plan in their heads, especially police officers. And I assume firefighters, God bless them, but I'm just talking about police officers right now, law enforcement officers. We are consistently planning if something happens here, whether we're on duty, whether we're off duty, you're looking at things and you walk into an environment, and not everybody, because some people like to shut everything off when they, right, that hypervigilance, they just want to turn it off and go into, I'm at home mode. But majority of people, they'll walk in different places and go, if somebody came in here, what would I do? It's this constant kind of planning. It's this constant kind of thinking, how would I address this situation? But that does not mean that when you come upon that situation, you're going to have that hero moment. I mean, I can speak for myself where I was off duty and it was my son's birthday. And I think he was maybe 8 or 9 years old. We were driving home, and just a few blocks from our house, we came across a car that had slammed into a brick wall and was on fire. And there were people there, but you could see that someone was trapped inside the vehicle. And I had the hesitancy of, I have 2 kids in the car. Do I just drive past this? Or do I have a responsibility? This is within my jurisdiction to stop. And I did stop, and I constantly questioned if that was the right idea, because in my head, in the back of my head, the whole time, I was thinking, this is my son's birthday. Mm-hmm. Is he going to be, and I made sure I parked behind a car so they couldn't really see what was happening, because there were a couple cars parked. So I parked back. And in the end, I mean, I don't want to turn this into a long story about this, but in the end, this person died in the car. But I remembered coming up on the car, it was actively on fire. And there was a moment when I was just about to try to stay and continue trying to open the door, where I was like, should I be here? Should everybody, any one of us be here right now?
Right.
Because this thing could, explode. Now, most cars don't, but it's not like on TV. And I reminded myself, I'm like, but our concern right now is this individual. So a bunch of us stayed trying to open the door, but the way he had crashed into the brick, the whole engine block was, on top of him, and we couldn't open the door. We couldn't open the passenger door. We couldn't get him out the back because that was crushed, like the top of the truck was crushed. And someone was trying to hand a fire hose, and it was like, you can't, not a fire hose, excuse me, a water hose. I'm like, well, you can't put water, you can't put a fire out with that. And it was pretty big at that point. Tried what do we have? A fire extinguisher, didn't work right. And I just remember being on the phone with dispatch and saying, he's burning to death in front of us. Where are you guys? Like, for a fire. And it, even though I did not know this person, or I didn't have a personal connection with this person, it gave me an insight into people who are in that situation. They'll help us because someone's not there yet to help. But anyway, I mean, that was a slight digression, but I remember that moment, that second of being in front of, and of course there's millions of those moments. A time when we walked into a place where there was an active shooter involved, And it was like, hey, you might see dead kids in here today. You might see, people down. And as soon as we walked in, we're all stacked up. There's a guy down in the front, and I'm like, oh, here we go. We're going to see, dead kids. And the shooter was still allegedly inside the house. And you have to say to yourself, this is it. This is the time. This is what I'm here for. This is why I've always signed, this is what I signed up for. But that is not innate. That is still a decision. So every one of those people who stepped in last night or who step in another times, that's got to be a personal decision. We can train and talk about it, but I don't think we can ever say to somebody, this is what you should do. Right. Because, and again, also every situation is totally different. And that's why we have to provide fluid training for people, right? Fluid training based on who they are, based on the circumstance. I mean, and you have to read a circumstance in like a second, and that's why I think a lot of it ends up in the end being instinct.
Yeah. And I think what needs to be remembered too, which is important to point out here, is that may be your job. That may be what you've quote unquote trained to do. But real world anything is not the same as simulation or theory or idea until you're in it. And working with military veterans for well over a decade now, and I don't claim to pretend to understand the experience as someone who did not serve in the military, but in listening and trying to appreciate their experiences, and I've heard people say, well, they knew what they were getting into. They knew what they signed up for. You knew what you're doing as a firefighter or a police officer, first responder, military, et cetera, corrections officer. You have an idea. It's a theoretical concept. It's just like anything. You go to school and you study psychology, you study business, and you have conceptualizations of things, but it's very different when you put it into practice in its real world. So people need to remember that when
we train for that either. We don't train people
I don't think we
have
can.
that moment. You know what I mean? Well, we don't talk about it. We don't really discuss it for our guys. We don't say, in that moment, this is what you might feel. This is how you might react. That's never discussed in the academy, really.
No, and that's a problem.
Here was my scary situation. Think what you may about it.
And I think that's a problem because without the discussion, it perpetuates the stigma, especially for men and people in hyper masculinized professions, that we're not supposed to talk about things. And my point in bringing it up was that we need to remember that you, as the responder to that scene, that you're a casualty of that event as well, because you have to. And I don't care. And I will go to toe with anyone who wants to argue this. I don't care how well trained, read, prepared you are. No one can really forecast what their response to a given situation will be until they're in it. And I think we need to respect that. And we have to remember that all those that respond to incidents are victims, if you will, of these events. I'd like to ask you a question, though. I remember after the shooting several years ago, I think it was at the Municipal Center or something similar out in Virginia Beach. Mm-hmm. And I was interviewed by a journalist out of, I think, Providence, Rhode Island. And he said, now that you've heard this happened, or when you heard about it, what was your initial response? And I said, well, my initial response was kind of flippant in that, well, here we go again. And what we're going to find out is pretty consistent. So we don't know much about this particular situation. It's an emerging case. We'll learn a lot of things. And you and I are not clairvoyant. We are not Miss Cleo. No. We don't have an 8-ball.
And don't you hate it when people get on the news, though, and say, let me tell you what this is going to be?
Well, but we are, I'd like to think, informed about this based on patterns and based on research and what we've seen, which is not always 100% consistent, but because we're not in the world of prediction, but highly probable. Tell me, what do you think we're going to hear about this unnamed, intentionally, subject who perpetrated this? What do you think we're going to learn about him, where if people are out there saying this was senseless, why did he do it? We're going to hear some familiar stuff that you and I hear all the time. So what do you think we're going to hear that we're probably going to agree on?
So prior to that, I want to just go back for just a second when we were talking about first responders and how they are victims of the situation as well. Completely, 100% agree with you. I do believe, and this is my belief, that when we sign up as law enforcement officers, the majority of us, it's not that we're looking to be in that situation. We're not. But we accept and understand that that's the situation that we've agreed to. And again, you don't know how you're going to react when that moment happens. But we do know that we're there every day in order to protect our community, in order to protect the defenseless folks who are in there in order to protect, people who need protecting. And so I can only speak for myself that even though I might have a moment where my brain flashes, my kid is here, my two kids actually are here, or this is happening, or what if something happens to me, I think it, I feel it, but it's always going to be a feeling behind the action. For me, and again, I can't speak for others.
That makes sense.
For me, and then for many others I know, we know when we do know what we're signing up for, and we do believe in it, and it is important for us to run towards the danger to protect everybody else that's running away from it. It really is an important factor in what we do, and I think that has to be part of our training more at the front end. This is what you're really getting into. This is the reality, and we need to have more simulation and things like that with, paintball and all that kind of stuff. But you can't simulate the reality of real fear. But anyway, so what do I think the main thing I'm gonna see is that this person's going to be isolated. This is going to be an isolated individual who does not have a lot of connections with other people. We're talking about the mass homicide in Colorado Springs at the LGBTQIA club. This is going to be someone who just has not been engaged and has not, and I'm not going to I don't go into mental health issues or anything like that, because as you and I both know, a lot of the folks who have been in, these shootings or these mass attacks, don't have diagnosed mental health issues. They may have some mental health issues on deck, but they don't have diagnosed mental health issues. And again, very important, which we haven't really discussed on here, is that it's not that someone who has a mental health issue is more likely to commit violence. It's just that someone who has committed violence may have a mental health issue. And wouldn't it have been nice if it had been addressed and engaged and discussed, and this person got some help beforehand. And by help, I don't mean necessarily always psychological help, right? It could be, someone who's in a situation with children in a school, and they've been isolated by a group, or they've isolated themselves because they don't have great social interaction skills, something along those ways. It's always going to be someone who's got, obviously a grievance. We talk about that always, of course, on the, pathway warning behaviors. What's this person's grievance? What's their fixation? What's their ideation? Right. And I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think we're going to hear a lot of the similar things that we hear all the time. And the mental illness piece is really important to point out because, we know statistically you could remove all the mental illness in the world. And I wish we could for the sake of those folks, one, to avoid the stigma, and two, just not to have the impairment that sometimes come with it. But most people with mental illness are super high functioning, brilliant people where it does not do what the average person thinks. But we need to recognize that even if we got rid of mental illness altogether, you're still going to have violence. It's just the same as, this is non-political. You could get rid of every gun in the world and people are still going to find ways to carry out their attacks. And we've seen that in Canada recently with a significant surge in knife attacks in schools and amongst young people. So if people have it in their script to carry out violence, they'll find a way to do it. I think we're also going to find and hear that, probably within the past 2 years, there have been some significant changes in circumstances for this person that were unwanted. Mm-hmm. Often it's some sort of adverse experience in school or in the workplace, suspension, termination. Maybe failure to get into school or get into, let's say it was a law enforcement, someone who couldn't get into the academy and they were really determined to do that. So some sort of loss, some sort of stressor in their life. I think we know that we're going to hear about this. There's probably going to be discussion about the psychological wellness of the individual. And we have to, I think, agree that people who carry these out are not psychologically well, but that doesn't make them mentally ill. So whether or not this person had a mental illness could be there, but either way, with or without, this person wasn't in a place of good mental wellness at the time. They were probably feeling something, whether it's symptoms of anxiousness or feeling depressed or sad or despondent or hopeless or anger. All healthy, normal experiences that we all have, but just lacking the coping strategies or the ability to see alternative ways to deal with it. And therefore, this seemed like the other option in that sense.
And I think that's really important
because it made sense to
say
the
what
person.
Psychological wellness really is, right? And I like that, how you broke that down, because when people hear psychological wellness, a lot of people may just jump to, oh, they had mental health issues or whatever. Psychological illness, just to dumb it down to the complete bare minimum, you're hurt. You're hurt and you're not dealing with it, in a way that would be as healthy as one might be, right? And the whole world gets hurt. The whole world, has these, ways of coping that are negative coping mechanisms, positive coping mechanisms. And it's in a time when people, and that's why I started with isolation, because when we have that, that psychological unwellness, right? And we have that, we end up becoming isolated unless we have that outreach. I mean, you and I talked about it earlier today, we were talking about leadership. How many different places, how many workplaces, schools, communities, right? We know what creates a great leader, right? Someone who makes you feel valued, trusted, like you matter, they care about you, that you're providing a contribution that's worthy. I mean, that's it. But how many places do we actually see that? I mean, we're getting better in the world, right? We have all these great things that talk about threat and threat assessment, threat management. And that's what that really is, right? Is creating great leadership, valued, trusted, you matter. What you're doing is contributing is positive. How can we help you? How can we inhibit violence by, creating this wonderful, as much as we can, positive environment around you. But we just don't see that. We don't see it as much as we should. It's so basic. It sounds like, well, if it's so basic, why aren't we doing it? It's a really simplistic thing to do. But we don't always feel like we have the time to do it. And so therefore people get left by the wayside. And that's why people who are psychologically unwell don't get the connection and engagement that they need.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to hear about that here in some way. And when you take all the totality of the circumstances for all of these individuals, when we review them in the aftermath and hindsight retrospectively, it's not that difficult, or it shouldn't be, if we stay truly objective, to say, based on the circumstances, based on everything, we can understand why this person would make a decision to do this. We're not condoning it, endorsing it. It doesn't mean it's rational, doesn't make it logical or anything of that sort. But, the only way to really help people is to try to embrace their reality and see it from their perspective. So there's going to be a very disturbing reality, but that's the one we're going to have to work with to try to understand it. And by doing it, that's how we prevent it. To make this very generalizable to the public about when we talk about this mental wellness piece, every single one of us, I don't even have to know you if you're listening, has experienced a point of feeling psychologically or mentally unwell. That doesn't mean you need therapy. That doesn't mean you need to be on prescription medication or have a diagnosis in the DSM manual. Think about a time where you were in a relationship, happy, and then it broke up. It ended. The person, even in high school, we kind of minimize like high school and puppy love dating, but it's real. Those are real emotions for people. So during a breakup, or someone close to you passes away, you're not celebrating. You go into stages of bereavement and grief. You feel sad. And those are normal, healthy responses. But in that response, you're not at your optimal wellness. Understandably so. It's appropriate. That doesn't make it disproportionate. But every one of us have had moments of mental unwellness for different reasons, right? We're struggling. Look, right now, groceries are more expensive than anything. Everything is more expensive. So more people are probably dealing with financial stress and hardship, which doesn't make you function as well as maybe you could, because you're thinking about all those other things, right? That are kind of bringing you down. I think all of us can appreciate what it's like to have moments. It doesn't mean we live in it or stick with it. And most of us also have ways to deal with this that aren't what we just saw here.
Right. Because I was going to say, so what if you're a listener that says, yeah, I've had all those things, but this wasn't my choice. I didn't choose to go out then and, target and kill people of whatever community it happens to be, right? Because we've seen places where the community itself is targeted, like perhaps because this was, and we don't know, right? Because we don't know anything, right? At least at this point about the perpetrator. Did he target, the LGBTQ plus community, or was that the bar closest to his house? Right? I mean, we don't know yet. Or did he know somebody who worked there? Was it something that was personal that also happened to encompass perhaps the community as well? So I think at least at this point, since we're talking so much about the offender, I think it's just a really important point to say we do that because we are so invested in understanding the why in a way that can actually help, hopefully, prevent violence in the future. But the victims are always on our minds. The victims
and I know what you and I...
The main issue and fact here for us, and our heartbreaks absolutely for them and their families.
Yeah, and I mean, if we had the names and photos of these folks, that's what we'd be showing today, just to kind of pay, respects to them. But you bring up a good point. Like, we don't know if this person actually worked at that club. We don't know if this is somebody who is struggling with their sexual identity and, sort of saw this population of folks with a degree of envy. And if I can't have that sense of being me that you are, I need to destroy it. We saw that with, remember, the spree killer who killed Johnny Versace was struggling with his own. And we see a lot of issues of identity and masculinity in the presence of these folks who carry them out, struggling with feeling adequate. We saw this in one of the shooters with Columbine, who had some physical defects and deformities. We saw this with the shooter up in Newtown, Connecticut at Sandy Hook, who struggled, very emaciated, thin, what we would consider masculine or male figure, and created this alternate persona for himself that lived in this virtual world. So we're finding ways to fill gaps.
Right?
And for this guy, the power of being able to play this godlike role by determining the fate of other people could have been what he needed to experience a sense of control, a sense of importance, a sense of connection. And sadly, that may have been his only way to feel like he could connect with the outside world. All different explanations. And the reason we're bringing this up, I think, is important. So we don't immediately jump to, well, he must have been mentally ill and we have a gun control problem in this country, because I think we're not going to take a side, pro or other. I think we can point out the obvious statistically is that, one, we know these events are incredibly rare. Two, they don't just happen with a particular type of weapon. And three, I think more importantly, we know that given the number of weapons that are owned in this country, particularly firearms, and how many people respect the power of what that can do, and appreciate what the instrument or tool is for in various forms, whether for hunting or otherwise, most people don't use them for these sinister, malevolent reasons. And your point was, one last thing is you said,
yeah,
well, the average person could be listening right now saying, but I've been bullied. I played video games. I have a gun and I didn't do this. That's because none of these things cause this. It's the collective of multiple things, and often just the state of desperation where maybe had they had that connection and resource, they would have been able to consider another alternative. And then there are those very few in this world who are just, we like to use the term evil, who just lack the ability to empathize and don't care. Right. There are those folks out there, but that's not necessarily, they must be mentally ill.
And again, very important. I am not a psychologist. Retired police officer, right? But I would put Paddock, the shooter from Las Vegas, in that capacity. But talking about that, that's why I started with isolation, because it's that lack of intimacy, right? People who have connective, engaged, positive, relationships don't go out and kill a bunch of people or try to target people in that manner, where it's a targeted act of violence. People have, and you might have, parents who want to be engaged with the individual, but they can't based on whatever's going on in their life, or maybe sometimes it is a case of mental illness or whatever it happens to be, or they just don't know how to connect with that person and they're not getting any help from the community around them, which is why I really, truly believe we have to have effective threat assessment and management teams and the way we operate business across the world, quite frankly, but we'll talk about the U.S. here, in each one of our law enforcement agencies. We can't just have some checklist where we check everything off without a process, right? Oh, this guy's dangerous because blah, blah, blah. Here, let's give it to the district attorney. We have to have the capability of doing things differently. It's not that, we can't afford to stand up a whole team. We're too busy, going from call to call to call. We have to look at threat situations differently and understand what the concept of leakage is, right? Where somebody makes a statement that might not be an arrestable threat or criminal threat, but it's letting us know, for lack of a better way to say it, hey, we can't walk away from this. This sounds like it's actually this person's going down a bad path right here, or this person's isolated, this person needs assistance, this person needs help. And a lot of the emergent mental health services we have that, right, if you're a danger to self or others, right? So then we give them emergent mental health services. They're not the best. It's not the best environment. It's not that the care is not great, but the environment's not great because these environments are hosting everybody who's having an emergent mental health crisis. Right. Not necessarily someone, who's dealing with, that isolation and lack of intimacy and grievances and things like that. So I think it's just absolutely imperative that we have these relationships. Law enforcement has these relationships with our mental health staff, with our district attorney, with parole and probation, with the schools, with, everybody who can lend, with adult protective services, child protective services, where everybody's working together. You don't have to be like a team that's like, puts on your vests and all rushes out to a situation. I mean, sometimes that's great, don't get me wrong. But you do have to have that networking and that engagement and the component to say, I know what these people do. I know what this agency does. They know what I do. How can we help this person? How do we get this person into a place where they're not so isolated? They do realize that other people care about them, in order to kind of minimize that potential for violence. And as we've seen, there's so many opportunities and examples to show how that just doesn't stop after a month. You have to keep going with that. Right. And that's why we talk about mental health and great mental health resources, because they're the ones who are best equipped to deal with people over a long period of time, engaging with law enforcement too, and showing actually a lot of folks, law enforcement isn't just the person who's going to show up and arrest you. I mean, we have things out there for, community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing. We have teams with mental health resources. We have teams with parole and probation, and that's where we're the greater, grander law enforcement who actually deals with things in advance, because prevention is so important as well as response.
Yeah, well, as you and I were talking about right before this call, and I can't get into too much detail because it's an active case, but like I told you, we had a situation emerge recently where there was such a trail of behavior, which doesn't necessarily mean this person's going to do something significant or sentinel, but they were all these little clues to say, this person's not doing well, they're struggling, they need help with something, because often acting out behavior, insubordination, disruptive type behavior may be a clue that, hey, I'm just not doing well, I'm struggling, and that's an opportunity for us to be upstanders, not bystanders. Now, often we don't want to get involved. Why? Because, well, if I report it, I don't want to get them in trouble, I'm afraid they won't trust me. We do it thinking we're doing the right thing because we could get someone hung up when we're missing an opportunity to help them. Had this individual,
and that's why leadership and culture is so important, because your leadership is messaging to you, it's okay. We're here to help, and don't get me wrong. I mean, it's not like, they have to help. It's not like we have to have a team of psychologists ready to go for everybody, but you know what I mean? If you have that symbiotic environment where everybody's working together and you feel like you can trust your supervisor to go talk to them about something, then we're kind of breaking down that barrier of, I'm worried about getting someone in trouble.
Yeah, but if you're not leading, then you're just managing, and managing doesn't foster leadership type relationships where connection is established. And that's the problem. So in this one, we missed a lot of opportunities. This whole paper trail, could have intervened here, could have said something here, could have just simply said, how are you doing?
Just to clarify, you're talking about your case, not the one.
Exactly. Going back, anything that you wanted, it didn't. And then there was a series over years, could have been here. We could have captured it here, here, here. Opportunities to say something like, are you okay? Do you need anything? Simple stuff, just showing up. But we were never given an opportunity to show up. It's just sort of passing the buck. And sometimes it was like, oh, I'm scared of this person. If I don't say anything, it won't be my problem. And what happened? We finally got to a point where after all these behaviors, and you know what? Maybe for that person, all these clues that went unattended were received as, I'm asking you for help and you're ignoring me, you're neglecting me, you're rejecting me over and over. I've got to make this bigger so you really hear my struggle. And what happened? Finally, it reaches a crescendo. And the next thing you know, I mean, it's endangering the lives of other people because bullets are flying. It's a sad situation. Fortunately, it didn't end up like what we're talking about with the Colorado Springs case and the other this week. And I want to touch on those cases as well and speak on those, one, to honor those that we lost for those, but they're also very different and interesting cases, but really impacting young folks. So
can I just add real quick that when we look at those, I want to make it extremely clear for anybody who might be listening. We're not saying that when someone has a bad performance review and they act negatively about it, or they're making statements at work that people feel uncomfortable with, that we can predict that down the road we're going to have an incident where someone's going to end up, taking a gun and shooting people, or driving their car through a crowd of people at a Christmas parade or whatever it happens to be. What we're saying is these are opportunities for us to engage with someone when it's a bad performance review and we're saying something perhaps that doesn't, come off as great as we'd like, because that person needs that engagement. That person needs that connection.
Right. Exactly.
And if we do those things and I always call it, death by 1,000 cuts, because when people look at threat assessment, threat management, they think, oh, I'm preventing that huge active shooter situation. Well, yes, you might be, but in reality, The death by 1,000 cuts is the bad performance review, the supervisor who doesn't understand you and maybe treats you very badly, or you're getting divorced at home and you showed up and there's no furniture in your house, or, your parents were abusive and you've never engaged with anybody on that or gotten any help for it, or whatever it happens to be, right? Just come up with about a billion different things that people deal with every day in either human resources capacity or at a university, wherever it happens to be, right? And if we have a culture and we've created an environment, we have programs where we can engage with people on those things and we don't let them go by, right? And side note, I got to put a push out there for a book called Fierce Conversations by, I believe it's Susan Scott, that talks about don't let situations get really bad before we address them. Address them here and directly and transparently, right? I mean, let our, I say all the time, let your freak flag fly, right? Get out there and address it with people so that it doesn't get to that point, right? So, because I don't want anyone to think, we're talking about prediction or we're talking about anything. No, we're not. We're saying we need to be more engaged and connected with people now. It creates better environments. It creates more productivity. Sure. It creates happier people along the way. So anyway, I just want to
and perhaps, statistically and relatively speaking, these events being super rare, maybe 1 in 10 million will go on to perpetrate one of these acts. Really, it's that infrequent. But out of 1 in 10 million, there's still, 9 million plus other people that are getting your attention that still need some help. So we shouldn't just be looking for this person that we think is going to do something this extreme. We just need to be aware and a little just more open-minded and responsive to anybody who we can help. I think it's just being a good human, a humanitarian, showing compassion. I mean, and it's an opportunity to do something really good. Now, shifting a little bit, not shifting gears, this was another one that we're unfortunately having to discuss out of Idaho. I haven't delved into this case too much other than just what I know on the surface. So I'm wondering if you know more about these 4 students who were found murdered, and I believe it was in an off-campus home. And was it Idaho State? Idaho? Was it Idaho State? I don't want to give any.
I think it's University of, but I'll have to look it up. I apologize, and that's terrible that I don't.
University of Idaho.
I'm so focused on the University of Idaho. I've been so focused on the loss of life here, as well as at the club last night in Colorado, and then the loss of life for our Virginia football players. It's just been one of those weeks where we're scared to let anybody go. We're scared to let our kids go out and do anything, right? We're scared to let our family live their lives because with the advent of all the electronics and media that we have, it's in our face. It's immediate and right in our face, right? 20, 30 years ago, something like this happened. We weren't intimately involved. I mean, one of the victims, their sister, has been sharing information on social media about things, kind of left and right. And I have not read all of that, so I want to be clear. But we wouldn't have had that 30 years ago. I mean, she was the one that kind of called out and said, get out of there. We don't know who did this, and there's been a mass exodus of University of Idaho students who are just like, I'm not staying here. I don't know.
Wow.
And parents who've been calling their kids home. And it's not the University of Idaho, right? It's the environment that they were in, and the parents don't know who this person is, that's killed these 4 kids. So they're scared to let their kids stay anywhere. So I think that's important to say, that we're not saying the University of Idaho is an unsafe place. It's just that the parents are now panicking, right? I mean, if your kid went anywhere where something like that happened in the town they were in, you'd be nervous to let them stay in the town.
Well, let's be fair, isn't it?
Right.
Isn't it reality as a parent yourself, like me, both of us being parents and talking with parents with older kids, that, I mean, you live a lifetime of worrying how your kids are and what they're doing and if they're okay anyway, let alone to add this degree of a variable to it. It just makes it more palpable and more extreme. So it's understandable. I think it's sad. You look at these 4 faces, they're smiling. I mean, we always say, the future, the opportunity. It's just disheartening. And then this is the one that really, really got me this week in particular. And I commented on this on a social media site. I put this same picture up, and I just want to comment on what I saw. And these were the 3 football players from the University of Virginia who were targeted and gunned down. Sadly, I looked at this picture and I thought of a couple things, and we don't shy away from difficult or honest conversations on this podcast for sure. I looked at the thing that stuck out to me were the 3 smiles of these.
Right.
And I was struck by, I'm like, these are not the smiles of people who are just putting them on to pose for a picture. I started trying to get into the worlds of three people I've never met, never know, very different than me for many reasons, obviously, way more talented to be able to play at UVA. Let's start there.
Of both of us, way more talented.
Yeah, so
for sure.
But the authenticity of these smiles, because you see the crow's feet and their young faces by the eyes, which tell you this is real. And I go, wow, I wonder if this was the photo that was taken, their first photo on the team, thinking about a potential NFL career, if that was in their cards. I'm not saying
moving forward of everything.
And let's be real. I'm not saying, three young black males, their only option here, what they were thinking about was the NFL. But if you're playing college football, I would imagine that regardless of where you come from, that's a thought that could be a potential. That's the highest.
And your college experience, everything that you're getting to, experience through the university or through whatever it happens to be, right? It's just that expectation of life moving forward. The future's so bright for these three, for the four folks we were just looking at, all, and I don't mean like this in an attractive way, but I mean all beautiful souls, right?
Beautiful, handsome
souls who had experiences ahead of them that they should have been allowed to have. And I think maybe resonate with this one too, because this one, we know who the perpetrator is. We know that he was in a dark place for a little while there, and we know that this was a targeted violence situation. Whereas with the four young kids in Idaho, we don't really know what that situation is yet. We don't know why that occurred. We don't know why that happened. Regardless, make it very clear, this is never the end result. This never should be the end result. This is never what somebody should. I don't care what happens. I don't care what negative situation anybody goes through. This is not how we solve the situations we end up in. And of course, again, there's all the discussion that we talked about with how people get there. But this is never. And to see so much loss in 7 days. And then, I'll throw on top of that, we had a ton of police officers in the past couple of weeks also get killed in the line of duty. And it just so much loss in your face because you're seeing it every day. And I think it's really important, because we're seeing it every day, to really reverently, think about these folks and give them, them and their families the due of the pain and horror that they're going through right now.
Yeah. I have a couple final thoughts on this, and I think it'd be a good place to you started off by saying we were going to talk about three cases today and people that were largely marginalized. We talked about the LGBTQ population at the club this morning in the early hours, where 5, at least at this point, have been pronounced dead and 18 critically wounded. But I look at this, and one thing I commented on that post when I remarked on this case was it's already, and I don't care, could be a controversial statement for some people, but I think it's statistically relevant, is that it's already more of a challenge for young black men to reach particular goals because of just marginalization, inherent, the way things are. And there's progress as we've made strides, but too. Exactly. I mean, that's the brutal truth, but it's already more of an immediate disadvantage. And I can acknowledge my white privilege till the sun comes up. And I'm not claiming to speak for other people who are different than me, but I am try to be open-minded, I think, as we both do, and say that already having a disadvantage of no fault of their own to achieve this, to make it to this point, and have those smiles,
which is amazing for any kid, quite frankly, amazing for any kid. But then
exactly. We can't not acknowledge the added layer of difficulty that comes with the absence of certain privileges that you and I might have because of how we look. And I even acknowledge the advantage I might have over you because of how I'm born.
Your maleness.
Exactly. That's just reality. I didn't choose it, but I have to embrace it. So I look at this, I think it's just really unfortunate, but I think we can, kind of conclude with, we've offered some pretty important lessons and tips in this brief time about what people can do. And really it's about showing up. If you're concerned about something, you have an opportunity to do something, and maybe that will help us not have to put up these memorializing photos of people with such beautiful smiles, beautiful hearts. These three from UVA, the 4 here from Idaho, and unfortunately, we don't have the photos from those in Colorado Springs for this case that happened unfortunately this morning. But yeah, just devastating. So, but I hope there's a good, valuable takeaway for people, and that they find something that they can use and bring in day to day here. Any final thoughts for you?
Well, I think this is the absolute surface level, obviously, discussion regarding these 3 cases, and that we're going to have discussion, as time goes on and as news comes out, right? I think it's always really important to understand that the initial news reports, whatever they happen to be, whether, media cares or doesn't care, or, I know some great news reporters. I know some that aren't so great.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to know that it's going to take time. We have to not just look at the scratch the surface of things, look deeper into, reasons and situations and circumstances, and have real discussions about that, and have real discussions about, was there an opportunity, to help along the way, and not to, and of course I say this because I have not lost. One of those people is not someone I know, but not to vilify the person who didn't, step in, but say, how can we change it? How can we change it for moving forward so that we don't have that, right? We don't have this situation again. And we have opportunities to step in. We have the capacity and the opportunity to step in. But I think this is just the scratching the surface on this. We're going to have more discussions on these cases as they move forward. But it's really important for us to have that real information, because right now we acknowledge we don't have the information about these cases because they're just not known yet. When we do know them, that's when we want to have that real discussion about what was going on, what was happening, what's the reality versus what are you being told on that, the pretty 2 minutes that you might get, or the 30 seconds or whatever. And by pretty, I mean horrible. But like just the, talking head on the media. And again, a lot of media tries to do a good job, but, a lot doesn't. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I know I have to say that because I was a reporter before. I have some great friends who are in the media who really give a damn. And, they're constantly, taken apart by the populace because people think they don't care. But we really do need a real conversation about these cases, maybe in a week or 2 weeks when we get some more information about it, so we can kind of revisit and, take a closer look and see what opportunities and what options moving forward, other communities, other schools, other, might have, other law enforcement agencies might have, so that they can, maybe change a little bit of the way we do business to just do it better. We don't have to do it in a more expensive way. We just have to do it better.
Well, the final request for today before we sign off, we have 3 requests. One is, like, subscribe if you want to keep getting notified when we have new episodes coming out. We're just getting into this. We're launching it. We're excited. But also the takeaway for today, I think, is as we learn more about these cases, future cases, Colorado Springs in particular that we spoke about a lot today, focus as we learn about what could have been done or what should have happened or where we could have done something different, instead of just ruminating and perseverating on what we should have or could have, think about the would have, should have as what we can do moving forward. So use those, let's put them into practice. But for those of you who decided to spend your time with us, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time we're here.